Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the Statewide Cooperative Partnership for Local and Regional Markets. I'm Kate Siebold. I work for the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and I'm joined today by a few of my team members who will introduce here quickly. But thank you so much for joining us today. And I think we've got a full agenda, so we're going to go ahead and get started, but some more folks may be trickling on here. So before we get started, I just want to note that today's webinar is being recorded. So this session will be posted to our website so that others can access the data presentation afterwards. Under state law, the recording of this session will also be available to anyone who asks to see it. So we're recording now. We'll keep that recording going through the duration of the presentation. And when we get to the Q&A section, we'll stop the recording just so we have a nice clean recording to be able to share with others who want to learn about the data. All right, so our plan for today is to provide you with a brief introduction to the Statewide Cooperative Partnership. We're going to highlight our data collection process, and then we're going to share some of that data out with you. And we'll briefly give you a sneak peek of kind of what's ahead in the rest of this three-part webinar series, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So we would love for all of you to introduce yourself in the chat. You can put your name, your organization or farm, if applicable, and then let us know where you're calling in from today. And while you're doing that, our core team here for the Statewide Cooperative Partnership Project is going to introduce themselves. So again, my name is Kate Siebold. I work for the Minnesota Department of Agriculture as the Regional Marketing Specialist. And so in that role, I work on the Statewide Cooperative Partnership, as well as farm to school and other wholesale market development. And I will pass it next to Lebo.
Hi, everyone. It's great to see you all here. My name is Lebo Moore. I work at MDA with the Produce Safety Program and the Local Food Purchase Assistance Program, and also with Kate and Hikaru and Casey on the Cooperative Partnership. So I'll pass it over to Hikaru.
Hello, everyone. I'm Hikaru Peterson. I'm in the Department of Applied Economics at the University of Minnesota on the St. Paul campus, and have been delighted to be part of this journey for the past 2.5 years with my MDA colleagues. And then Casey, well, I'll pass it on.
Hi, I'm Casey. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Applied Economics, and I work with Dr. Peterson as a research assistant.
Wonderful. So thanks everyone for introducing yourselves as well. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. If you want to go to the next slide, just a few reminders on Zoom. I know many of us are probably familiar with Zoom by this point, but please just keep yourself muted as we go through the presentation. And then during the Q&A section, you'll be able to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question. Feel free to use the chat. So as we're going through the presentation, if you have questions on your mind, throw them in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that and revisit questions posed there during the Q&A section. Also let us know if there's any technical issues that we need to know about. And then reactions, you are welcome to use the raise your hand function during the Q&A section so that we know you have a question that you'd like to pose. And then other reactions are welcome throughout the presentation as well. All right, so next slide, we just want to start by kind of helping you understand what is the Statewide Cooperative Partnership. We know that we recognize some names on here of folks that have been involved in this work, and also see some new names, which we're thrilled about. So the Statewide Cooperative Partnership is a collaborative effort led by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and the University of Minnesota in partnership with many organizations around the state to establish baseline data of local and regional markets and respond to market issues and needs by pursuing a collaborative approach for dedicated, ongoing local and regional market support in Minnesota. And the key word there is definitely collaborative. On the next slide, you'll see some of our many partners in this work. So over the last 3 years of this project, the common thread to our work has really been fostering partnership with the many different players in our local and regional food systems around the state. And so we're really grateful and appreciative for the many different partner organizations that have been along with us on this journey, provided input into the surveys that we'll be sharing, and helped us to think about the data we've collected. So next slide shows just a quick summary of this project to date. So the Statewide Cooperative Partnership is currently supported by a 3-year grant from the USDA Federal State Marketing Improvement Program. And we are in our 3rd and final year of that grant. That grant will be ending in September. The first year of this project was really focused on gathering what's known. We did background research and wrote a literature review, which is available on our website. We also did an asset mapping exercise, and we established small contracts with partner organizations to help us collect preliminary community knowledge that can help inform and guide this work moving forward. In the second year, we focused on data collection, and we'll be sharing some of that data today. So we did our data collection in 3 rounds. We did a producer survey that was focused on small and mid-sized farms in Minnesota that are selling into local and regional markets. We also surveyed supply chain partners, so entities that are making, selling, or distributing food around the state. And then we finally surveyed consumers, so residents or people who work in Minnesota. And we are now in the 3rd and final year of our grant, where we're looking ahead. So we're very excited to be able to, start sharing out this data that we've collected, and in doing so, hear back from partners and community members around what this data is telling us, and based on what we see in the data, what we consider to be key strategies or priorities for supporting market development and market access moving forward. So we're in the process of developing action priorities, which will be the focus of our 3rd webinar in this series, where we'll be asking for input on that. And then as we finish out this grant, we'll be writing a final report that will include recommendations for local and regional market development. So the focus of today's webinar is really going to be about the data collection and starting to share some of that data. So with that, I will pass it to Hikaru, who's going to share more about the data collection process.
Yes, so this chart summarizes the more than a year-long process that was involved in the baseline data collection. As Kate mentioned, there are 3 surveys that we conducted, and each of the surveys really took months of collaboration with the partners and the project team to really design the instruments, and then months of distribution to make sure that it was administered to the folks that we would like to hear their experiences from. The producers and supply chain businesses, we had a lot of collaboration from our partners to distribute. And then the consumers is the only one that we had a short version that was piloted at the Minnesota State Fair. I don't know if any of you made it out there to the Minnesota Grown booth or not, but there was a survey going on. And then that findings from the pilot informed the wording of the version that went out at the end of 2022. And then it was distributed through a Qualtrics panel to a randomly stratified sample so that it would mimic the demographic characteristics of our state population. And just a little bit more detail about who we were trying to hear the experiences from. And so for the producer survey, we had a cutoff for anyone in Minnesota who sold approximately $500 or more in agricultural products to local markets. That 500 cutoff is lower than the agricultural census is $1,000, but we really were focused on trying to reach producers of a smaller scale. The supply chain survey were targeted towards individuals, businesses, and organizations, and also institutions that really had anything to do with food, either make, distribute, or sell food in the state of Minnesota for human consumption. And then consumer survey, again, the target was somebody who resides in or works in Minnesota, but primarily purchases their food for personal consumption within the state border. And then here you can see some of the items that we collected in order to deepen our understanding of the experiences and needs for local and regional foods. And after all these efforts, it will be really important for all of us to acknowledge the different sample size that we have from these surveys. And so from the producer survey, we have 497 usable responses that we've heard from. For supply chain survey, we had 37. And then for the consumer survey, we have 820. And then we have plans, as Kate mentioned, where, after we've finished collecting, we're in the process of trying to make sure that this data is accessible to as many folks as possible. And here's like our draft plan for how we would make that happen over the last several months. Before the end of the project. For the consumer survey, we will make the entire anonymized data available through the data repository for University of Minnesota. So anybody can access it and look at it. For the supply chain survey, because of the small sample size, we will provide a report with the summary of responses to each survey question. And then for the producer survey, we will provide a similar item by item report, but we'll also try to generate region-specific summaries. And so for organizations that might be trying to develop like a grant proposal that uses a particular, local information is helpful, then they can refer to those region-specific summaries. And we're also looking into different options for folks who are not used to seeing data in charts or graphs to be able to tell perhaps a little bit more storytelling associated with the data, and we're exploring that option as well.
So we, much of the data and many of the outcomes that we're going to be sharing today are coming out of a data party workshop that we hosted in February for members of the Statewide Cooperative Partnership and other agricultural and food systems leaders. So we gathered there are about 60 of us in February who gathered for 2 days at the Wilder Foundation to look at all of the data that's gathered. You can see here this picture. We had giant posters showing the many graphs and data visuals. And kind of process that data together and then began to think about what we saw as potential actions to take using the data. So if we go to the next slide, we have just a very quick trailer for a longer video that we created that kind of highlights the data party. So this is just a quick segment to give you a little look at what the data party was like.
The Statewide Cooperative Partnership is a collective effort between the state and university and more than 40 partner organizations to gather baseline data on Minnesota's local and regional markets that can be used to support market access and development for Minnesota farmers. In February of 2023, the partnership came together for a 2-day data party and workshop at the Wilder Foundation. This meeting was the culmination of 2 years of relationship building, knowledge gathering, and data collection. It was also the kickoff for the partnership's next phase of work to build a vision and identify strategies for supporting local and regional market development in Minnesota.
So again, that was just a quick preview. We do have a longer, it's about a 6-minute video that we can share out that provides a little more context about the data party and workshop. So with that, I'll pass it back to Hikaru to share more about the data.
Yes, so as Kate mentioned, we had 12 different posters, or some of them were placed on the table, so we call them placemats, that summarize the data so the participants in the data party can help process and be nerdy, be geeky over the data that we had. And today we have over the next webinars, we'll be sharing some of the data with in this webinar format, but we can't cover everything in a short time. And so I know that Kate has emailed out the placemats in a PDF format beforehand. So I would really encourage you to take a look at it. If you hadn't received one, please let us know, and we can share that as well. But today, what we're planning to do is to cover the participant profiles, which gives us some ideas about who the producers were, who the supply chain businesses were, and then also the consumers, even though we don't hear too much about it in today's webinar, but we'll talk more about it in the next weeks. We also would like to Lebo, if you want to advance the next slide, we'd also like to talk about the crops and food products that are produced and also demanded in our local and regional markets. And then we'd like to focus on two themes of the data. They're both related to the producer axis, one to land and resources, and then the other one to markets. And so let's jump right into the participant profiles. And so here is a summary, a snapshot of who are in our producer survey. And one of our primary objective was to collect data on farmers that were perhaps not counted in the agricultural census, but we wanted to complement that. And it's helpful to see how they compare. And so you will see that almost all, our 500 producers are not even like 1% of the farmers that are included in the 2017 ag census. But you'll also see that proportionally we have more farms. So we have 0.72% of the number of farms, but then less land. And so 0.16% of the 0.16% of the land in farms. And so we have smaller farms represented than the number of farms in the agricultural census. We also see that proportionally we have a greater market value of the product sold, suggesting that a lot of these producers in our survey are produce farmers, proportionally more, resulting in a higher market value of products. Here we're looking at the distribution of farms across acres to kind of give you a more nuanced comparison between our producers and those in ag census. And so you see that 47% of our producers are farming fewer than 9 acres. But you also see that even in our focus of small and mid-sized farms, that there are some large farmers included in our producer survey as well. This chart is probably perhaps important, validating the point that we really need to complement the farmers that are counted in 2017 ag census. In fact, only 37% of the participating farmers in our survey participated in the 2017 census. And you'll see that 30% have never participated in the agricultural census, and then 28% not sure if they ever participated in the census or not. We were able to capture some of these producers that were different from ag census, and here's another way of looking at that. Particular differences, you'll see that we are proportionally more farmers who are historically underrepresented, and here we are seeing the numbers in terms of the women producers, but then we also have the ethnic and racial breakdown in the next slide. We also have proportionally more new and beginning farmers, which USDA defines as being farming for 10 or fewer years. And then we also have proportionally more certified organic farmers. And of course, there are probably a lot more in our survey that would claim that their farming methods follow organics, even though they're not certified. And then another major difference is that there are a great number of our producers are selling directly to consumers. And you will see later in the slides that we have a higher percentage of specialty crop growers as well. A lot of these, producers are historically underrepresented and missing in the existing agricultural census data. And so it's our hope that our data could be helpful in designing programs and grants to work on the challenges that are experienced and impacted by these producers. And then here's the racial diversity between the Ag Census and our producer survey. And one of the key reasons why we were able to reach these different groups of producers than the Ag Census were the mini contracts that we used and the cooperative partners who work through their work to make sure that these producers of different groups were able to participate and complete our survey. So I'll pass it on to Casey to take a look at the other participants.
So this chart just highlights the supply chain survey. So again, the supply chain survey had a much smaller sample size than the producer or the consumer survey, with a total sample size of 37 participating businesses. So this chart breaks down the businesses by the functions that they operate within. Businesses could select multiple different functions, so that's why you see that the numbers don't add to 37, as well as the number of employees they have and the total gross sales. You can see that a lot of the businesses operated as processors, food manufacturers, in the distribution warehousing space, as well as retail and food service. And in our sample, we had a lot of very small businesses, as well as a few very large businesses, with the average total gross sales of about $1.5 million and a cost of goods of about $2.3 million in the food category. And then this slide helps break down where each business is selling to and then where they are purchasing from. So on the far left chart, you can see the types of customers that the participating businesses serve. So a lot of these businesses are serving individual customers, restaurants, cafes, and other food services, as well as institutions like schools that are serving food. And then the middle chart, you can see the types of suppliers the businesses are purchasing from. So a key group that they're purchasing from is directly from agriculture producers, as well as we can see distributors, wholesalers, and warehouses. And you can see this broken down. There's a key in the far left corner by the type of function the businesses are participating in. So you can see the difference in where different types of businesses buy from. This chart has a lot of data, but this really just shows that the respondents in the consumer survey, which had about 800 participating consumers, really tried to mirror the population of Minnesota as a whole. So the consumer survey was sourced via a purchase panel on Qualtrics, where they're able to ask screening questions to try to get a representative sample. So in this chart on the left corner, you can see that we had respondents from all over the state, a lot of people in the metro, as is representative of the population. You can also see that the age, household income, and racial breakdown roughly match the population, although our sample was slightly more educated than the average Minnesotan. I'm going to pass back to Hikaru.
Thank you. We collected a lot of information about the crops and food products that are being produced and supplied, and also, sold in our local and regional markets. And again, it's probably better. It's one of those types of information that it would be great if you just stand in front of the poster, but we'll try to give you some of the highlights to give you a flavor of the type of information that we have. And so this is we noted earlier that the average farm size across all our participating producers were 81 acres. And here it's like how they break down across crop sectors. And so as we expect, agronomic field crops like grains and oilseeds are produced in a larger scale than some of the other crops. It also shows on the far right column there how many different crops are grown on each types of these farmers that we might aggregate by sector. And as I said, the producer survey really collected granular information on exactly specific crops that these producers grow on their farm. And it really captures like the broad range of agricultural products that are grown and raised. So these are just a snapshot. In fact, we didn't put a chart for the vegetables because there's so many and it doesn't quite fit in a legible form in the slide. But you can see by the percent of producers that are raising these crops on what are some of the prevalent products that are raised on our farms. And here, we also, many food products are processed and manufactured by the supply chain businesses in our state, but we also note that there are many products that are produced on the farm by the producers themselves. And so 44% of the participating producers in our survey produced value-added food products for human consumption. And you can kind of see that, again, the breakdown of how many folks were producing, identified producing certain types of food products, and then also how they were considered, like whether they would be classified as a cottage food products, or whether they were identified, preserved, certified organic, or halal as well. And then here this is an information from the supply chain businesses, but we collected all these granular information about whether the supply chain businesses were purchasing certain products, and then also whether they were interested in purchasing them from Minnesota sources, and then also like which month they were interested in buying them. So again, this is just an example, just looking at the fruits on types of products, whether, how many businesses were currently buying from Minnesota-based sources, how many were interested in buying from Minnesota-based sources, and then what type of, whether they were interested in year-round supply of these particular crops, or whether there were specific months that they were seeking to have them delivered. And so we're hopeful that this kind of information, not just for fruits, but for other crops, can help inform Minnesota producers about market opportunities. And again, please spend some time on those placemats or the posters to take a closer look at some of the other crops. And I'm going to pass it over to Casey to talk about one of the first themes.
So the next section is about producer access to land and resources. In this section asks a lot of questions about what describes the ownership of the land you're currently farming, as well as things like what has been a barrier when you're trying to finance your farm operation. And then we broke a lot of this data down by different self-selected descriptions of farms, for example, women-owned or immigrant-owned. So in general, from this chart, you can see that most farms in our sample were small to mid-size, with an average gross annual sales of about $95,000, and on average, they're about 50 acres. And most producers stated that they owned at least some land, with 72% of producers selecting this. However, when you compare this to different historically underrepresented groups in our sample, you can see that these numbers vary greatly. In particular, historically underrepresented farmers had a much lower gross sales, and the land ownership percentages were substantially lower than 72%. Something else I want to note is that our sample contained a large percent of first-generation producers. And we can see the difference between first-generation and multi-generational farmers who had a much higher sales. Is my audio a little better now? I'm sorry. I also want to note that the producer survey did not do a great job of working with tribal nations that make up a big part of the food system. And this is something that we talked about a little more in the legislative report and recommendations for future work. This next slide focuses on farm financing. You can see that about 69% of the producers in our sample are financing through non-farm funds. About 57% of the producers are financing through farm operation funds. And this is a select all type question, so some people might be included in multiple categories. And you can also see how this varies across different self-selected groups. we can see that a higher percent of underrepresented producers are financing through their own personal funds. And then finally, this slide focuses on different barriers that people face while they're trying to finance their farms. So key barriers include lack of information, which was a barrier for about 28% of farmers, as well as technology, paperwork, and the logistics, which is a barrier for about 20% of producers. You can see that there's a large group of producers who reported they had not faced any barriers while trying to finance their farms. But this percent varies greatly, again, when you look at different groups of producers, like first generation versus multi-generation producers, as well as historically represented groups again. One of the most interesting pieces of data for me was this question where we asked, who do you go for as a source of information? And you can see how much this varies depending on different farmer characteristics. Something that stood out is that a lot of farmers really rely on other farmers as a key source of information. So about 79% of the total respondents said that asking other farmers was how they got their information. You can also see the differences depending on the different groups of farmers. So in general, immigrant and minority-owned farms are seeking information from different organizations like nonprofits at a much higher rate. And are using programs like the Minnesota Department of Agriculture at a much lower rate. And this is just highlighting kind of the importance of looking at this data while we're trying to make informed decisions about different programs. I'm going to turn it back over to Kate.
Great, thanks, Casey and Hikaru. So a few kind of just summaries for this section on producer access to land and resources. I think that Casey and Hikaru touched on a lot of these points already, but we did just want to highlight some of the discussion and outcomes that participants at the in-person data party came to when looking at the data. So folks who engaged with this data at the data party noted the percent of farmers that are self-financing with non-farm food funds, which was 69%. Some thought this perhaps seemed a little high, while others thought it seemed very accurate. And in general, we heard from some folks that this data seems representative in terms of farmers seeking advice from other farmers. Sales numbers broken down by demographics represent vendors at farmers markets, and high rate of immigrant farmers reporting barriers to accessing financing. Another note was, sources of advice numbers potentially indicate a strong need for engagement and outreach within MDA and the university to better reach communities and be seen as sources of information. There was discussion around the 5% experiencing discrimination and whether that was representative. And also some discussion on how geographic distribution of the experiences may shed additional light. So again, these are just a few outcomes that we wanted to share. There's a lot of words on these screens. We will also share out this slides afterwards as well, if you want to be able to go back through and read some of these other takeaways from the data party. And with that, we'll move on to the next section.
Yes, so this section had a collection of items where we were asking the producers, how much of their total sales were allocated to different types of market channel type, and if they had any kind of barriers that they face when they are trying to sell their products. And so farmers were asked to select, all channels that were used to sell their products. And as we noted earlier, that 78% of all our respondents sell directly to consumers, and it's a stark contrast to the 5% that are represented of these producers in agricultural senses. You also see that 37% use a direct institution, 23% make sales to supply chain businesses, 15% sell to the community organizations, and then also 47% make some sort of a donation of their products as well. I looked at shares of sales across these outlets by different groups, but I didn't see much variation, and therefore I don't have a slide to kind of indicate this. The differences that I noted, a few of them in particular were intuitive. And so, for example, the multi-generation farms had higher sales share to supply chain businesses. It seems like they're more perhaps familiar with the market structure that exists in the marketplace. Immigrant farmers had lower sales shares to direct to institution, and also higher sales share to the community organizations on average, which is also quite noteworthy compared to the other groups. We also asked more detailed questions about each of these individual supply chain and market outlets, which we can look at on the next few slides. So this is the summary of their response to the direct-to-consumer channels that producers report using. And you see that the most common one, in fact, is the on-site retail. So these are the situations where they might have a farm store or farm stand. And then, more than half of the respondents are active on the farmers market, followed by online retail, and then the community-supported agriculture and other direct sales format. For the supply chain businesses that are being sold, the majority or the most common one was the wholesalers. It's really, you could call them wholesalers, distributors, or packers, aggregators, all of those that specialize in buying from the farmers and then selling them to another retail or another distributor, for example. Those are the business types that were most commonly sold, followed by processors, food hubs, and farmers cooperatives as well. And of the community institutions, these are the only options that we provided in the survey. And so you see that there's a huge number of folks who said, they sell to other nonprofit organizations, which we might need some unpacking to do to understand what was going on. And just a reminder that these are sales to these community institutions because donations were included as a separate category. Lastly, let's talk about the barriers that producers reported as they face in trying to access these markets. So you see on the far right that far left, that summarizes the response from all farmers. And you notice that the most common barriers reported is the finding buyers, followed by receiving prices that are below cost, and then transportation, delivery of logistics, and also not having enough volume that makes it meaningful for sales. And as we stratify these responses across different producer groups, you do see that some of the structural differences, how these experiences may vary. So in the table below, you see on the top row going across are the experiences for all participating producers. And for each of the four main barriers that people noted, and I apologize that it's not in the order that are listed, but you see the finding buyers on the far right, and then the going from the right to left, you have the not enough volume, receiving prices below cost, and then also the logistics challenges. And I'm just highlighting the rows for the minority farmers and then also the immigrant farmers. But you see that proportionally more of these minority and immigrant farmers are facing 3 of the 4 barriers disproportionately than the producers overall. It is interesting to note that not having enough volume to secure a large enough sales volume is actually a common, or at least proportionally experienced barrier across all producers.
Great. So to summarize again, just a few takeaways from that folks at the data party saw that, again, I think Hikaru and Casey mentioned, was, a large number of women farmers and first generation farmers who responded to the survey. The observation that immigrant owned farms have significant and consistent barriers. farmers struggling to get a price that will cover the cost of production, and a sense that more granular understanding may be helpful as we think about immigrant communities, breaking down some of those barriers more, and then also understanding direct to institution and wholesale accounts and where sales to restaurants or grocery stores fit within the data as we have it now. There was also discussion on whether some geographical areas may have been overrepresented or underrepresented in this initial survey, and that some profitability models would be helpful across various outlets, so farmers markets, CSAs, wholesale markets, etc. So I think if we go to the next slide, this is that was all the data we planned for you today. Again, this is just a part of the data. So the data placemats that we emailed out this morning have the 7 that we just shared, as well as the 5 that we'll be highlighting in next week's webinar. So next week, we're going to dive into local food supply chains, food safety, demand for and expectations of local food promotion and the Minnesota Grown program, and then consumer access to local foods. And we know that there's a lot on each of those data placemats, especially if you print it out, it's going to look really small. So thanks for bearing with us on that. Maybe use the Zoom feature. But again, we'll be walking through all of that again next week. And then the final webinar will be on May 17th, and that's where we will share with you a draft of action priorities that emerged from that data party on how people would like to see this data put into action and what strategies we can take to do that. And you will have the opportunity to provide feedback. So we really hope that that you'll join us next week, as well as for part 3, we will be recording them as well. But just wanted to give you a highlight of that. And with that, I think we can head into Q&A portion. So I know that there's been some questions that have been put in the chat, and you can definitely keep asking them there. Or if you have a question that you want to ask verbally, you can raise your hand.